The Tiananmen Lesson, this is from The Gun Rights War by Neil Knox, starts on page 84. It's dated June 14th, 1989. It was clear that all the government had to do was wait. The multitudes of demonstrators in the immense government square had shrunk to a few thousand, and more were drifting away every day. But the hardliners were determined that the demonstrators shouldn't escape unscathed. Such protests could lead to open rebellion and violent revolution, like the one that had created the present government. With the heads of government divided and wavering, the army decided to act. Disobeying the orders of the president, the commanding general of the army lined up his forces facing demonstrators and ordered them to disperse. The demonstrators didn't think the army would attack. It did. Tanks rolled into and across the demonstrators' ramshackled huts. Marching soldiers with fixed bayonets and assault rifles and tear gas followed the tanks, clubbing and bayoneting and shooting. The army later said the demonstrators rioted. The generals claimed army soldiers were attacked. Many of the demonstrators were wounded. The number who died will never be known. The government claimed it was only one. The commanding general declared that the demonstrators were driven by the essence of revolution and that it was beyond a shadow of a doubt that the demonstrators had been about to seize control of the government. The commander was General Douglas MacArthur. The place, Washington, D.C., not Beijing. The date was 1932, not 1989. The assault rifles were bolt-action Springfield Model 1903s, not AK-47s. The peaceful demonstrators weren't students in Tiananmen Square demonstrating the equivalent of our First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, freedoms of assembly, and the right to petition the government for grievances. The demonstrators on Washington Mall and nearby Anacostia already had those rights. Their problem is that they used them. They were Americans, World War I veterans, thrown out of work by the Great Depression, lobbying for government to immediately pay their promised veterans bonus. No, the attack on the bonus marchers, bad as it wasn't the brutal mass murder unleashed by the students in Beijing. The American people wouldn't have tolerated it, and had the means to stop it. What happened at Tiananmen Square was the kind of ruthless tyranny that has occurred in other lands throughout history, and is precisely what the Founding Fathers feared might be done by the powerful central government if they were creating under the U.S. Constitution. That is why the people refused to ratify that Constitution until it was amended to guarantee certain individual freedoms known today as the Bill of Rights. That's why the First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech, assembly, and petitioning the government were backed up by the Second Amendment guarantee that the right of the people to keep and bear arms would not be infringed. And when, during the debate on the amendment, some senators attempted to limit the right to only apply to the common defense, which is what some people today say it is, the Senate rejected it. That piece of legislative history clearly shows that the Second Amendment was intended to be an individual right, not merely a collective right states have to a militia. Most of the constitutions in the world, even the Constitution of Soviet Russia, contain beautiful words promising freedoms that only U.S. citizens enjoy. The reason, as unintentionally acknowledged by the anti-gun crowd, is that only in the United States do individual citizens have such relatively free and unfettered access to firearms. But instead of glorying in that unique freedom and the freedoms it guarantees, some in the establishment are attempting to eliminate it with too much success. This nation has existed for 150 years without any federal gun laws. The National Firearms Act, attempting to tax out of existence machine guns and the short-barreled shotguns, the bill originally included handguns, was enacted in 1934. Don't kid yourself. The reason was Thompson toting wasn't with a reason. Don't kid yourself that the reason was Thompson toting hoodlums like Pretty Boy Floyd, John Derringer, or Bonnie and Clyde. The real reason was to put fear into the establishment by those bonus marchers and the March 7th, 1932 march on the Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan, where police killed 4 and wounded 50. The government's fear was summed up by one of the co-sponsors of a bill to ban private possession of military weapons, whose only purpose is to kill. During the hearings, he blurted out, "What scares me is the thought of those veterans going against police. Vietnam veterans know how to use those guns." The legislator was testifying in Maryland hearings earlier this year on a California-type bill banning the possession of AK-47 rifles and other military semi-autos. I was there. I heard him say it. New Jersey Police Colonel Clinton Pagano, a determined advocate for prohibited gun laws, has said many times that gun control is people control. He's exactly correct. The objective never changes. Only the excuse used to promote it does. The first major gun control push in this country wasn't to control crime. It was to control freed slaves. The first Supreme Court decision on the Second Amendment, U.S. versus Cruikshank, 1876, so proudly cited by anti-gun liberals, held that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, meant only that it could not be infringed by the Congress, that the Second Amendment did not prohibit the Ku Klux Klan from conspiring with the local officials to prevent freed slaves from possessing guns and attempting political meetings. The next major wave of gun control was supposedly to deny guns to anarchists, which was a code name for immigrants. During the waves of immigration around the turn of the century, for the first time, the criminal element began actively using and promoting gun control as a means of disarming potential victims. Immigrant shopkeepers, accustomed to being bullied by thugs, corrupted police, and governments in Europe, had willingly paid protection money to thugs who helped support New York's corrupt Tammany Hall political machine. But their American sons began to arm themselves and began to fight back with their guns, which inspired Tammany politician Big Tim Sullivan to push through the 1911 law, which bears his name, requiring police permission to possess a handgun. Immigrants, like blacks in southern states, which enacted purchase permit limits, didn't apply. The U.S. didn't have a patent on people control through gun control. According to recently released government papers researched by retired West Yorkshire Constabulary Inspector Colin Greenwood, the British government deliberately exaggerated reports of armed crimes to justify their 1919 law requiring firearms licenses. The real reason wasn't to control armed crime, which was much lower then than now, but in an effort to control the Irish Republican Army. During the labor unrest of the 1920s and 30s, particularly during that already mentioned Great Depression, the main U.S. push for gun control came from big businesses. Frightened the strikers were, or might start, shooting back at Pinkerton guards and company-controlled private and municipal police. During the 1930s, firearms registration laws were enacted in most of the European countries that didn't already have them in the guise of crime control, but would prove to be of great people control benefit to the invading German army and subsequent the invading U.S. and Russian armies. In the U.S. in 1938, the national government required gun dealers to be licensed and required records to be kept on handgun buyers. But more restrictive gun control was promoted under a novel excuse: keeping guns out of the hands of the fifth columnists. Incredibly, in the spring of 1941, a year after gun owner lists were known to have been used by Nazis to disarm occupying nations, gun registration laws were pending in 40 U.S. legislatures. World War II put a stop to U.S. gun control efforts, as did returning GIs who'd seen how such laws had been used to enslave occupied nations and discriminate and decimate the Jews. But the debate began again in the 1960s. This time, the excuse was to keep Saturday night specials out of the hands of the juvenile delinquents who were supposedly buying guns by mail order. A new law eventually passed after the assassinations of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. But most observers agree it was not those murders, but the race riots that gutted and burned cities from coast to coast that provided the final votes for the Gun Control Act. It really wasn't crime control, for the firearms crime rates had more than doubled. It was people control. Throughout the 1970s, the major effort were to ban Saturday night specials, which were at times defined to include 2/3 of the handguns made. But most of the laws that were passed only eliminated the unsafe junk, which had predicted effect of upgrading the crooks' armament to equally or better than that of the police, for which the anti-gunners have avoided taking credit, but which they have been using to pass even more laws. In this decade, we've seen the Supreme Court decline to consider the clearly unconstitutional outright ban of handguns in Morton Grove, Illinois. We've seen Congress ban armor-piercing cop-killer bullets from which never killed a cop. And we've seen non-existent plastic guns banned. In each case, the technique was the same: to solve a non-existent problem with a broadly defined bill that banned much, much more than the guns or ammo than which created the supposed problem. This latest such assault is the attack upon semi-autos, which follows the same pattern. While waving around the AKs, they attempt to ban your M1 carbine, Remington 742, and Winchester 100 because that expanded definition ploy has become so obvious. The sponsored pullback only to ban about 50 models under the new California law, while giving the anti-gun attorney general the power to easily ban more by going to courts. In Congress, Senator Howard Metzenbaum's Democrat from Ohio, bill going to the courts in Congress, Senator Howard would ban 3 dozen. Senator Dennis DeConcini's Democrat from Arizona would ban a dozen, but the actual number in the initial list isn't important, for once the dam is cracked, it's relatively easy to pour more through. Again, the excuse is to prevent tragedies such as the isolated schoolyard murders of 5 children, but no rational person can claim this demented drifter would have been thwarted by the laws that his insanity created. Not even the most dedicated gun banner truly believes that semi-auto bans such as California's new law or the ones pending in Congress will affect the flow of drugs. Nor is it true that assault weapons are suddenly the choice of criminals. Okay. Since a semi-auto ban can't prevent isolated acts of insanity, since large capacity magazines are important only when someone is shooting back, since criminals do not prefer assault rifles, then why the ban? We know why Mexico prohibits private ownership, even temporary importation by hunters of all firearms chambered for military cartridges. They make no secret of their fear of revolution. We know why Poland had a registration and licensing law on all firearms. So when the government declared martial law on December 4th, 1981, they would immediately suspend all gun permits and call in all guns. We know why Soviet Georgia required all rifles and shotguns to be registered. So when their troops killed dozens of protesters with poison gas in Tbilisi, earlier the year, the government could seize some 66,000 guns in only a few hours. We know why the Chinese government won't allow their people to have any form of the AK-47, but why won't the government of California allow Californians to have them, unless registered to allow easy confiscation? Why does President Bush and Senator Metzenbaum want to deny them to Americans? Do they or any other official of the U.S. government believe that they have something to fear from the armed citizenry? If they do fear the people, perhaps it is with reason. And I, for one, would like to know what that reason is. These who wrote the Bill of Rights gave us the Second Amendment as an insurance policy to make sure that a Tiananmen Square massacre could never occur in America. Its beauty is that so long as freedom insurance exists, it's never needed. In recent weeks, in watching the powerful television scenes from Beijing, we have witnessed what can happen when the people have no freedom insurance. I am not truly worried that the U.S. Army troops and tanks are about to be unleashed upon Americans, but don't tell me it can't happen here, because it has happened before. Thank you for supporting our projects. If you'd like to buy us a cup of coffee, check out our Patreon channel.
The guys and gals at gunwebsites.com encourage you to take a CCW class every year, practice at least once a month, and carry every day. Thank you for watching gunwebsites.com.